Hey there, in this video we are going to take a look at using the Sonicware Texture Lab as a granular effects processor. Anyway, before I begin, just a couple little things I want to note. Just a little word about my setup here. So nothing very interesting or fancy going on, but just to clarify, this right here, it's just a mixer, just a volume mixer. I've got my guitar, my violin, and my OP1 plugged in here as inputs. This line is an output, and then it's just going directly into here. And so this is not affecting the sound of anything at all. And if I plugged in any of these instruments directly into the Texture Lab, you would be hearing the same exact thing. And then the last thing is, hi, my name is Daniel. I'm the guy behind this channel. I've never actually spoken on camera before. Usually it's just the top-down view with my hands doing the gestures that I do. Feels very weird to be on camera, and I'm definitely not very comfortable doing it, but I figured it'd just be good to be able to see me because I'm going to be playing the guitar and violin at various points, and I figured you'd want to actually see the instruments being played, and then I thought it would be kind of jarring if we suddenly shifted from the overhead view to seeing me. So here I am from the beginning. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started here. So in the Texture Lab, I am currently in an empty pattern, and I am not inside of effects mode. And that means whatever sound comes in through the line in is exactly what we are going to hear getting pumped out of it. So just the original dry sound. And so for my OP1, for example, that is going to sound like this. Okay, so that is my dry sound. And now the moment that I turn effects mode on by pressing this button here, we are going to hear the default settings for effects mode on the Texture Lab. So again, dry sound, and now effects mode. Okay, so it's not the most interesting sound in the world, but that's not the point here. What I'm trying to do is just make some things as clear to our ears as possible. And that is what exactly is going on here with the effects on the Texture Lab. And there's a few things that are going into this default sound that you are hearing. So our granular blend is set to the midway point, meaning that our sound that we're hearing is 50% the original dry sound and 50% the granular processed sound coming from the Texture Lab. Sort of, not really. Let me explain here. So I'm going to take our granular blend knob and turn it all the way down to 0, meaning that 0% of the sound is coming from the granular side of the Texture Lab, and so it should be 100% of our original sound, right? Well, not really, because remember, this is our original sound, and if I go back into effects mode, it's a little bit different, and that is because in effects mode, the reverb parameters get applied to the original sound too, not just the granular sound. And there are actually two things going on with the reverb, because on the reverb, by default, we have the shimmer set to the midway point. So if we crank that up, we're going to be able to hear it even more. Conversely, we can turn the shimmer completely off, and now we're just going to get a straight reverb. Now the reverb is by default set to only 30, so we have quite a bit of room to move up if we want to. This would be about double. Or we could go all the way up to 127. And make it even more reverberous, I guess is the word. And remember that we have multiple types of reverbs on the Texture Lab. By default, it's set to hall, but we also have room, arena, plate. And every time you change the reverb settings, the default values go back on. So shimmer's back on, let's turn that off. And one of the types is infinity, which is the most reverberous, most spacious reverb. And we can crank that guy super up, take the shimmer down, and then get really, really spaced out sounds. that just go on and on and on forever. I mean, not actually forever, but for a pretty long time. So anyways, that is reverb. I'm sure everyone knows what reverb is, but I'm just pointing it out because it is a major component in the sound that you're going to get out of the Texture Lab when using it as an effects processor. And actually the whole point I wanted to make here was simply that if we do want to get our actual dry sound, we have to turn the reverb off, since the reverb gets applied to the non-granular side of the sound. So now that I've turned the reverb off, now we're back to our original sound. Same thing applies to the filter. Again, I'm going to assume everyone knows what a filter is. I'm not going to go into this, but the point to bear in mind here is that if I put a high pass filter on and I crank that up a bit, it does get applied to the original sound. Okay, so anyways, with that in mind, let's go back to our default settings here. I am going to take the reverb off so that we can just focus on the granular side for now. And this is something that I often do when I am setting up the Texture Lab and I'm trying to create a patch. The very first thing that I do is I turn off the shimmer, I turn off the reverb, usually altogether, or maybe just leave a tiny bit on. I don't crank it up until the very end if I'm going to crank it up at all. And that's because it becomes really hard to hear what's going on underneath with your sound if it's reverberating all over the place. Everything becomes kind of blended together and muddled, which can be perfect for like a final effect, but can make it hard to make little tweaks to your sound to get it where you want it to be. So just a little tip here, turn the reverb off at the beginning and you can always turn it back on later. Same thing with shimmer, same thing with filter. Okay, so now that the reverb's off, the only thing affecting our sound is the granular side of the Texture Lab. And remember, the granular blend is set to the midway point, and so half of our sound is granular, half of it is original. Okay, so hopefully you can hear what's going on here, but just to give you another chance, let me play it again. Try to listen for where the sound begins and where the sound ends, and also pay attention to what I'm doing on the keyboard. So to make this even easier, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to count down 3, 2, 1, play a note, and then we'll just listen to it. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. Could you hear that? What is going on here, and what I think is maybe one of the most important things to keep in mind when using the Texture Lab as an effects processor, is that although we don't have access to the speed parameter in processing mode, if I try to change this knob, the Texture Lab just yells at me that it's in effects mode. However, we do have access to the secondary parameter on this knob, which is direction. And if we go to direction, we'll see that the default setting is random. And random here means a random mixture between grains that are getting played backwards and grains that are getting played forward, which are the only two options in effects mode. Since the direction only applies to the granular side of the sound, it does not get applied to the original sound, which is a major difference between using the Texture Lab in effects mode versus synthesizer mode. All right, so random is a roughly 50-50 blend between backwards and forwards. And so to really hear what's going on here, what I'm going to do is this. So first, let's change the direction setting to just going forward. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm just going to count down, play a single note, and let's just listen to what happens to it. So 3, 2, 1. So it barely sounds like anything is happening, right? Now, compare and contrast that to going backwards with the direction. Once again, I'll do a countdown and let's just listen to it. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that. There's a few things going on here. First, our sound is being played just normally from the beginning to the end, or beginning to end. I guess my image is flipped around in the camera. This is really hurting my brain. First, the sound gets played from beginning to end on the dry side of our sound. And then once it's done, we hear the same sound being kind of flipped around. I hope I'm doing this right with my hands. And then it's being played from the end to the beginning. And if you think about it, that is necessarily going to lead to two things. One, a delay in the granular side of the sound, because if we're going to play something backwards, well, we have to wait to get from the beginning to the end, and then once we get to the end, then we can flip around the sound. But we have to wait to get to the end to be able to do that, right? So there needs to be a delay in the granular side of the sound. And then at the same time, because we're playing the original sound, followed by a reversed version of that sound sent through the granular processor, we're going to basically double the length of the sound. So with that in mind, now we can see the difference here. So I'm going to do forwards playback again, just play a single note, 3, 2, 1. Not really much doubling, maybe a little bit longer because there's sort of these like stray grains getting played alongside of the original sound, but much, much shorter than what happens if we go backwards. I mean, if you count it in your head, I'm guessing that it's roughly double, maybe even longer than the original sound. This becomes even more evident if we take the blend and move it all the way to the maximum value, where 100% of our sound is now going to come from the granular side of the texture lab. So now we go back and we play forwards. Well, it sounds like sort of just a kind of weirdly distorted version of our original sound, but it's not drastically different than this. And sort of like just a kind of ringing version of it. Whereas if we go backwards, well, watch this. So I'm going to do the countdown, 3, 2, 1. Notice how the sound doesn't even begin to play until after I've lifted off my finger. So you can really hear that there is a delay going on here. And in my mind, this is one of the main choices that you have to make when using the Texture Lab as an effects processor. Do I want that delay or do I not want that delay? Now, if you don't want much of a delay, or if you don't want your sound to be like drawn out in time, then one obvious thing to do is to just set the playback direction to forward. Then we don't really have a delay. And I can play the keyboard on my synth in more or less the same way as I would normally play it, whereas I can't really do that in backwards mode because everything just becomes kind of muddled up in time if I try to do that same chord progression. I mean, that sounds kind of cool, but it's also much more confusing and hard to do. And if I try to play even more rapidly, it's just one big mess. However, just going forwards is not the only option that you have, because there's another option that we have even when we're going backwards, or if we're mixing in forwards and backwards on random mode, and that option is this, and it follows logically from what we just talked about before. So if our delay is a result of just the reality of the fact that in order to play something backwards, we have to wait to get from the beginning to the end in order for the end to then become the beginning of our played back reversed sound. Well, if you think about it, the longer that piece of sound that we're flipping around, the longer we're going to have to wait. Conversely, the shorter the sound is, the less time we're going to have to wait. And so if we take the size parameter of our grains, the size of our grains, and we make those grains smaller and smaller and smaller, well, the length of time we're going to have to wait to get to the end of them is also going to become shorter and shorter. And as it becomes shorter, we're going to have less and less of a delay, and we're going to have less and less stretching of our sound. So listen to what happens if I take our size and let's move it to, I don't know, 67. So still a delay, but it's less of a delay. And you can hear it even better if I turn the blend back to the midway point. So we'll hear the original sound followed by the granular processed sound, which sounds like this. So yeah, definitely much less of a delay. And if we move the size down further, let's go down to 41, for example. Even less of a delay. So that's another way of minimizing the delay and kind of time stretching, if that is what you want to do. However, it comes with a flip side, which you can really hear if I turn the blend back up to the top so that we're only hearing the granular side. Let me play our scale again. So compare that to our original sound. At the same time that we're making the grains smaller and smaller, we're also losing fidelity in our sound. And the smaller you make the grains, the less fidelity you're going to have. As we get down into like the 20s, we start getting into kind of bit crunchy territory. And if we go all the way down to 0, and now we're really in bit crunchy territory. In fact, we're so far into bit crunch territory that it doesn't matter where I play on the keyboard, the pitch of the notes is all the same. Which doesn't sound that great when we have the blend all the way up, but if we turn the blend back to the midway point, it can add a kind of cool staticky texture to the background. We can make it less extreme by turning our grain size back up to something like 22. And that's another general principle to keep in mind, which is that when you're dealing with really extreme sounds coming from the granular side of the texture lab, even if they're not usable by themselves, you can make them usable by blending them into your original sound. So keep that in mind with just about any sound that I show you here. Okay, so that is how to minimize the delay and time stretching, but we can also go to the opposite and try to accentuate that delay and time stretching. So to do that, we can turn the size all the way back up to 127. So now we're back to sounding like this. And direction is set to backwards. I'm going to go actually to random so that we have a mixture of forwards and backwards again. So we sound like this. Okay, and now to accentuate the delay effect, here is what I'm going to do. So in effects mode, we have an actual delay option on the texture lab. We don't really have it in synthesizer mode. This is exclusive to effects mode, and it's controlled by the position knob. So by default, that's set to 0. If I turn it back, we're going to get a delay. And that's just 27. If we go all the way up to 127, we get a super long delay. Now, usually we wouldn't want to have a delay quite that long, but if we do a short delay, you can start kind of kicking up this swirl of sound. And if you really like that swirly sound, something you can do to make it even more swirly is to randomize the delay. And that is what the position, random, rate, and depth parameters control in effects mode. So if I turn the rate fairly high up and the depth, that is going to be changing the length of time of the delay at the specified rate and depth of modulation. So what this is going to do in effect is it's going to take our sound and it's going to kind of leave this trail of delays behind it. And it's not just going to be one delay, it's going to be multiple delays because the delay keeps getting changed randomly in terms of its length of time. So it's easier just to hear how this works than to explain it, and the way it sounds is going to be this. Notice how long that keeps going, and notice how it's not just one sound that's being repeated, but multiple sounds that are sort of like tumbling over each other. And if we add some reverb back into the mix here, I'm going to turn the shimmer off. And get an even nicer sound. And then another thing we can do with any effect that we're producing with the granular side of the texture lab is that we can change the pitch of the grains with the pitch knob. Now, pitch is not going to affect our original sound. So for example, if I turn this up to 12, meaning 12 semitones above our original pitch, or in other words, 1 octave, well, on the granular side, if I crank our blend all the way to 127, it's now going to sound like this. Whereas on the dry side, if I turn our blend back down to 0, our pitch is completely unaffected. So if we blend those two together, we get this really nice kind of bifurcation of our sound into two different octaves, one of which is more or less our original sound with a little bit of reverb on top of it, and the other of which is our granular sound, where there's all sorts of things going on here, especially thanks to the fact that we randomized the delay on it. And so we get this swirl of sound in an octave above the original octave, which helps to distinguish the granular processed sound from the original sound. And it's something that's really useful just kind of across the board when using the Texture Lab as an effects processor. Doing this sort of octave bifurcation really helps to separate the two sides of the sound and let the ear kind of differentiate between them, and sets up this nice contrast. If we want to go up another octave, all we have to do is crank our pitch up to 24 semitones, and now we sound like this. you know what, I'm getting kind of sick of this sound. Let's switch to another one, and let me take effects mode off for a moment so you can hear the original sound. This is just a sample I made of my Korg Volca keys. Sounds like this. If we go into effects mode with all the parameter changes that I've made so far, we're going to sound like this. Listen to what happens if we crank the reverb up. And since on the granular side we're pitched up 2 whole octaves, it might sound even better if we drop our synth down an octave. So this is what our original sound is going to sound like. A bit too deep and muddy, but let's hear what happens in effects mode. Not too bad. All right, now, while I'm thinking about it, let me show you something else here. Got my guitar. Here's what my dry signal sounds like. And if I go into effects mode, we're going to sound like this. So if you've seen the previous video where I demonstrated the Texture Lab as an effects processor with my guitar, hopefully that sounds familiar because it's more or less the sound that I was producing in that first patch that I demonstrated, which I called Heaven. Now, I think there are some little differences. For example, I think the density I had set a little further up. So by default, the density of our grains are set at 63, the mid value. I think I had the density cranked up a bit. Let's see what that does. Yeah, increasing the density, as you might expect, makes our sound a bit more, well, dense, a bit thicker. Although one thing that you should keep in mind is that somewhat counterintuitively, when the density is set to the midway point, that's actually the maximum number of grains that the Texture Lab can produce. When you go beyond that value, what it does is, if I understand correctly, it essentially duplicates and detunes the grains to one degree or another. And so in effect, you are detuning your sound, but depending on what your reverb settings and other granular settings are at, it won't actually sound like detuning, it'll just sound like a thickened up version of your granular sound, like this. So yeah, I think there's 2 really major things in this sound. One is the swirling, and to kind of recap here, the swirling is being produced by our size being all the way up on our grains, our direction being set to random, which means we have some getting played back backwards, which means they're going to take longer to play out and they're going to be necessarily delayed. And then we're even further accentuating the swirling effect by randomizing our delay so that we have multiple delayed versions of the sound trailing behind our original sound. And then we're even further accentuating all of that by pitching up the granular side of our sound. And in this case, I was doing 2 octaves, but you could also do 1 octave up, which would sound like this. got a little bit carried away there, but as I just demonstrated, you can blend together multiple instruments and pipe them into a single granular effect, and you can get some really cool effects by doing that. Of course, if you were recording something, you could just run one instrument through one patch, record that, and then change the patch and record something else. But it can be kind of cool to just pipe everything in to the same effect and just see what happens on the other side. So anyways, that was 1 octave up, and we can also go octaves down. So 1 octave down would be -12. Our synth would now sound like this. And the guitar would sound like this. And we can go 2 octaves down to -24. I'm going to pitch the synth up. So here is our original sound. And now in effects mode, we sound like this. And on guitar, it sounds like this. It's so deep and low, you can barely hear it. And so you can use this in a few ways. On the one hand, you can just use it as kind of an embellishment or kind of like support for your sound, just adding this kind of deep resonance that's kind of indistinct and nebulous below it. Or you can really embrace it as a sound unto itself. But in order to do that, usually you're going to have to do one of a few different things here. Okay, so I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that the way that the Texture Lab is making the sound go down or up is by speeding it up or slowing it down. And if you think about it, if we're going to slow down the sound, that's going to make it take longer to get from the beginning to the end, or the beginning to the end. I still can't do this thing with reversing my hands. So if we don't want that delay, we don't want quite as much difference between our original sound and our granular processed sound. So a couple things we can do here. One is, remember, size is going to determine how long we have to wait to get from the beginning to the end of the sound. And so if we turn down the size, we're going to have less of a difference between the lengths of the two sounds. So now we're going to sound like this. Notice how our pitched down sound is coming much more immediately into our field of hearing. Same thing with guitar. We could also change the direction to just forward. Or if we just want to circumvent this problem altogether, we could turn our blend all the way up so that we're just hearing the granular side. And now we're just going to hear this. Now that we don't have to worry about the difference between the two sides of the sound, we could turn our size all the way back up, and now it'd be sounding like this. There is a pretty considerable delay now between when I press the keys and when we hear the sound, and I find that really, really difficult to play with. So I probably would recommend turning down the size so that we get more immediate playback. At the cost of losing some of our sound fidelity. And if we don't want that swirly effect anymore, if we just want to have a deep resonant sound, well, we can turn that randomization of our delay off, and now we sound like this. Go up another octave. And yeah, it's so deep that with the guitar you can barely hear it. I actually get out my violin so that we can hear what that sounds like. Okay, so for this, I'm going to begin by turning our blend back to the midway point, and I'm going to pitch down to 1 octave below -12 instead of 2 octaves, because I think that's a bit too extreme. And okay, let me go out of effects mode for a moment. So here is my original sound. And in effects mode, we're going to sound like this. So it almost sounds like I have a cello accompanying me, and I guess if we went down 2 octaves, it would sound like I had a double bass, very muddy one probably. That actually kind of works. Even try blending the OP1 in here a little bit. And actually for this, I want to reintroduce some of that swirling by randomizing the delay. Also set our direction to forwards. So I want to set that to random, and let's put our size back up. Yeah, let's see what that sounds like. Bit hard for me to do both things at once. If I really wanted to get this going, I'd have to create a live loop, which is a bit of a tangent, but actually maybe it's not, because that is one of the main ways that I use the Texture Lab and the hologram microcosm. Both of them really come alive when you're creating loops instead of just playing some linear piece of music into them. So this isn't quite what I was planning, but let me actually just show it real quick. I'm just going to do a kind of 2-bar loop here, and I'm only going to be looping the OP1. I'm going to turn on a metronome. It's going to sound kind of funky because it's going to be going through the granular processing, but let's just give this a go. Let's try turning our blend a little bit up here. And now we'll add some violin. You don't have any device that's capable of looping, well, first of all, I would highly recommend getting one. I think it's the single best investment you can make in music. It's such a great creative tool for being able to improvise music and being able to practice performing and learning how to do arrangements and learning how to play one part off of another and mix things together. I encourage you to get your hands on something, and there are even apps you can download on your iPad or iPhone or Android phone or whatever that cost like $10, so you don't have to shell out a lot of money. Or you could get a loop pedal, which you can get for super cheap. You definitely do not need to buy an OP1. But yeah, looping can really bring this to life. However, if you don't have a looper, you can still get a little taste of what the experience is like, because there's another feature I haven't talked about yet on the Texture Lab as an effects processor, which is freeze. And what freeze does is just what it sounds like. It takes whatever sound is currently being processed and it freezes it in place. You can activate it in one of 2 ways. One is you can just hold down the freeze button and then it'll turn green to show that it's active, or you can press hold and then freeze, and then it will continue to be frozen as indicated by the orange light until you disengage it. So I'm going to play around with that now. I'm just going to play some notes on my OP1, and then as they are being processed and we're hearing that processed sound, I'm going to hit the freeze button and freeze it in place, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so here we go. And freeze. And now I can sort of duet with myself with this as like my background. or back on the OP1. And let me turn the volume down on this for a moment. Another thing to keep in mind here is that when you are in frozen mode, you have access to all of the parameters and you can change them however you want. So, for example, we can turn our pitch back up to 1 octave down. Now you can probably hear things better when I play my violin. Actually, let me turn the blend down, because let me turn this down again. When we are frozen, any sound that gets input into the texture lab is not going to be processed. You're just going to hear the dry sound. So I have to turn the blend back down in order to be able to actually hear any new input, my violin in this case. And now we can blend that in. Let's turn the volume back up. Another thing to keep in mind here is this: when we are frozen, we have access to the position parameter, and if I take off the randomization of the delay, which turns in, I think, to a randomization of the position when we're frozen, we can now scan through the 6 seconds of sample that we have frozen in place. Let me turn the volume back up here. Notice how it's silent at the end here. I guess I just stopped playing because I was trying to do 2 things at once with my hands. It'd be really cool if you plugged in a pedal to this and were able to engage the freeze function with just pushing your foot so that you didn't have to take your hands off the keyboard to do it. But anyway, point being, we have access to the position within the little sample that we've created. And besides being able to manipulate any of these parameters however we want, we can also play on the keyboard of the texture lab. Keep in mind here that the only option we have for playing in effects mode is legato, so we can't do chords. We can only play 1 note at once, and if we turn the glide, I guess is the name of the value, I forget what it is off the top of my head, but if we turn that value up, we can glide between different pitches. We can make this super exaggerated by going even further up. So yeah, all sorts of possibilities there. Anyway, let's go back to randomizing our position / delay here a bit and disengage freeze. Okay, so I've kind of lost track of what I was even talking about at this point. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so we were originally looking at changing the pitch and doing what I called pitch or octave bifurcation with the granular effects versus our original sound plus maybe reverb and filter. And I've shown you octaves, and then one other thing I want to point out here is that in addition to octaves, we can also pitch up or down with fifths or fourths and get some cool effects that way. And to do that, we're going to have to change the pitch value to some funky values, which I can never actually remember. Let me just show you the trick that I do to remind myself of what this is. So I'm just going to play a C on my keyboard, and I'll actually turn the blend here completely off. And actually, let's go down an octave. Okay, yeah, that's better. And the way that I always remember fifths is the opening notes of Star Wars. I'm not going to play the rest because I don't want to get a copyright violation. But yeah, I always remember that interval. And then to find the right pitch value, I'm just going to play my note. And then let's turn our blend back up so that we can hear the granular side. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play my note and then pitch it up until I hear that same interval. So yeah, it's 6.8. I'm going to turn the randomization of our delay off again, just to make this a bit more clear. So yeah, you can get some cool effects going on that way too. Let's do this with my violin. Yeah, it's like this almost like otherworldly reflection of my original sound. It's like a version of me in a parallel universe playing the same thing, and then it's like getting filtered through some sort of cosmic disturbance or something. I don't know, but I think it's a really cool sound. We can also go down a fifth or a fourth, although fifths are a bit easier to handle for music theoretical reasons I won't go into. I think that's negative. I could be wrong here. So again, I'm going to do my same trick. I'm going to play a note. And so a fifth down would be this note here. So this is the interval I'm going to be listening for. And now I'm going to try to reproduce that effect by not playing this key, but just playing my original C and then pitching down with the pitch knob. I think it's 48. No, maybe it's 52. Yeah, I think that's right. I literally have to do this every single time I do this trick. No matter how many times I do it, I just can't remember numbers. So I'm kind of belaboring this point and pointing this out just because I don't want you to have to like refer back to this video every time you want to do this. I want to just show you how you can figure it out on your own. This is another really cool way of creating sort of a automatic accompaniment to yourself. It almost sounds like there's like somebody playing bass a little bit below whatever you're playing. You could also go a fifth below, 1 octave below your original sound. So again, I can't remember the number, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play my note here. An octave down would be here, and then a fifth below that would be here. So the interval that I'm looking for is this. Now let's see if I can find it with the pitch knob. I think that's it, 17.2. Let's hear what that sounds like. I think that's right. I could be a little bit off on the value. Maybe it's a little bit higher, a bit lower, but anyways, you get the idea. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is actually I'm going to just reset everything by re-entering that pattern and going back into effects mode so that we get back to the default parameters. Back to that good old sound. And now what I want to do is there's a whole nother side to the effects that you can produce with the Texture Lab. So far, we've looked at kind of big, kind of swirly, cloudy sounds. And if we increase the reverb on those, we get into really ethereal territory, especially if we start messing with the pitch and pitch things up or down an octave. But we can go in the complete opposite direction and really embrace the lo-fi nature of the Texture Lab and get kind of glitchy or gritty sounds. And that's what I want to look at next. So for this, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the density way down. In fact, let me begin by going all the way down to like, I don't know, 5. And let's play this. So yeah, our sound already becomes a lot more jumpy. And let me turn the blend all the way up so that we just hear the granular side. Yeah, definitely much more jumpy. And if we want to make things grittier, we can just take our size and turn that down. Let's go down to about the midway point. We really want to embrace kind of a lo-fi sound, might be a good idea to take reverb off, so let's do that. And we can take this even further. Let's go down to 37, let's say. Not that there's anything wrong with having reverb on these sorts of sounds. Let's turn reverb back on. I'm going to turn shimmer off though. Kind of prefer it without much reverb on at all, so let's make it really low, I don't know, 10. All right, now once again, just like I showed you with the thicker sounds, you can get kind of a swirling action going on by randomizing some delay here. Which is kind of chaotic by itself, but remember, we can always blend these sort of chaotic sounds into our original sound, so let's try doing that. That didn't quite work. I think I was playing too fast. Let's try it a little bit slower. Yeah, it can be a bit tricky. These sort of effects take on a life of their own, and you have to kind of figure out how to play with them. Or you have to modify them. So for example, maybe the rate of the change is too high here, so let's turn it down, and I'll turn down the depth too on the randomization of the delay. Let's see what that sounds like. Yeah, that makes it much more playable, but maybe I don't want it to be playable. Maybe I want it to be super chaotic. In that case, I can crank the rate and depth all the way up. Or something in between those two extremes. Now let's turn the randomization back off and go back to size. So at this point, at like the 30s, we're starting to get into really kind of gritty, grainy, kind of punctuated sounds. Sounds like this. I mean, compare that to our original. And of course, we can turn the size down even more. Let's go down to, I don't know, 20. Now we're getting into sort of distorted territory. Let's turn the blend all the way up so you can hear that. But we're still retaining the pitch information. But if we turn the size even further down, we're going to start to lose that. Getting really experimental here, really distorted, and at 0, it's just pure static. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that when we have the size fairly down low, so like even in the 30s, the shape parameter value starts to have a major effect on our sound. So by default, our shape is set to 0, and that sounds like this. But if we change that to 48, for example, it's a subtle difference, but it's noticeable, whereas it's not really noticeable when you have the size and density way up. Turn this to 94, get yet another sound. And I always forget what the exact values here are, but if we have, I think it's, if the size is at 30, and if we set the shape to about, I don't know, somewhere between 30 and 40, I think it changes from one sound to another. But yeah, if we put the shape and size both at about 30, we end up with this sound. Where it's really kind of this like punctuated, taking that sound and punching it through this like strainer or something. I don't really know what the right word for it is. But that can be really cool with a variety of sounds. Let's go back to that string synth sound we had at the beginning. So remember, that sounds like this. And in effects mode now, that sounds like this. And little minute changes in the shape can really affect the sound. Turn the shape more up. Turn it even more up. Go all the way up. Or all the way down. So yeah, shape has a major impact on the sound when you have the size and density of your grains down low. Another thing that has a major impact on your sound is your timing. This whole time I've had it set to the default value of lush, but we can turn it down, and now we're going to sound like this. Almost nothing. So let's turn it up a bit more. Let's try 44. So yeah, our sound is kind of fading in and out like it was coming through a radio or something. It can be kind of a cool, purposeful effect when we have the blend set to the extreme value. But if we turn our blend down and mix it into our original sound and just add kind of a cool texture to the background of it. And you have to kind of play around with the blend value to find some sort of sweet spot. I kind of actually like that. It's kind of a cool static going on in the background. And speaking of static, if you like that static, another thing that you can do here to make your sounds even grittier or even glitchier is to play around with the randomization of the size and shape, which we have access to here. By default, these are both set to off. Just go like way up to 100 on both of them. See what that sounds like. I'm going to turn the blend all the way up so you can really hear it. Let's hear what this sounds like with my violin. Hey, so I got to the very end of recording that video and I started turning off all of my stuff, and I have my camera. It's actually just my phone doing the top-down view up here. You can't actually see it. It's right there. And I looked down at the phone, and to my horror, it was off. The phone had died about 2/3 of the way through me recording the video. And so now here I am the next day, and I'm going to try to redo what I did yesterday. Fortunately, I was right on the cusp of doing a pretty major segue into a whole nother section, so the transition should be fairly smooth. But actually, before I go into that next section, there are a couple of loose ends I want to tie up and that I forgot to tie up yesterday. So maybe it was all for the best. So the first thing is this. I think of the sounds that you can produce on the Texture Lab as an effects unit as falling into 3 categories. There's the kind of swirly sounds that I focused on at the beginning. There's the more glitchy sounds that I was starting to get into towards the end of the last section. And then there's also a third category that I think of as just kind of lush or ethereal sounds. And there's some overlap between that and the swirly sounds, but I think they're also kind of distinct. And I sort of glanced at the ethereal sounds when I showed the reverb, but there's a little bit more that I could show with that. So let me just do that real quick. So I'm back to just an empty sequence and the default parameters for effects mode. For these kind of ethereal lush sounds, we generally want to crank the reverb up, and there's no bigger reverb sound than the infinite reverb, so I'm going to switch to that. I'm going to crank it pretty far up. Let's do 100. Let's go crazy here. I'm going to put the shimmer down at least for now, and by default my blend is set to the middle here, so we are getting the granular side, unlike when I showed the infinite reverb yesterday. And so right now, again, our dry sound sounds like this, and in effects mode, we now sound like this. And then just keeps going and going. Okay, so that's a pretty big sound. Maybe big would be another good way of describing this category of sounds, but there's things we can do to make it even bigger or more ethereal. One obvious thing to do is to crank the density up. So it's at the midway point by default. Let's put it all the way up. Now we sound like this. And if we want to accentuate things even further, we can do the same trick that we've employed multiple times now, which is the pitch or octave bifurcation thing. So for example, if we go up to 12, 1 octave above our original pitch, now we're going to be blending those 2 octaves together and we'll sound like this. Alternatively, we could go a whole octave down, which will sound like this. Notice how it's a bit hard to hear the octave down, it's a bit washed out, so for this I might turn up the blend so that we're leaning more on the granular side, which is the side that's being pitched down an octave. So that would sound like this. Notice how there's a bit of a delay there between the 2 pitches, between the granular and dry side. So remember, one way we can take care of that, well, there's 2 ways. We could, instead of having the direction set to random, we could just go to forward. That'll sound like this. And or we could also take our size and crank that back a little bit so that we have shorter grains. For these, you could even take your blend and crank it all the way up. We're going to lose the bifurcation this way. We're just going to have the deep sound, and that'll sound like this. Maybe a bit too much reverb, so we can always dial that back a little bit. Let's try 62. If we want to go really deep, we can crank this down a whole 2 octaves to -24. I can barely hear it, so I'm going to take my OP1 and pitch everything up 1 octave. And of course, we don't need to even have all this reverb on. We could really dial it back to hear our sound a bit more directly. You might have noticed that I have this microphone down here, and that is because this sort of big ethereal sound can be really good for vocals as well. So I'm going to put the reverb back up a little bit. Let's go back to 60. I'm going to put the pitch on -12, 1 octave down, put the blend back a little bit, and then let's turn this guy back on. So I basically just replaced the microphone for my violin with this cord here, and so now I can speak into this microphone. Testing, testing, which sounds terrible when you are just talking into it, but you can get some pretty cool effects if you're actually singing. Let's try turning the size up. And let's see what happens if we turn the pitch back to neutral, back to 0. Starts sounding a little bit like Sigur Rós, or however you pronounce that Icelandic band's name. Been a fan of them for like 20 years. I've seen them in concert. I should know how to pronounce them. And of course, you could also go up an octave. And as sort of a performance effect, you could also do a thing where, since you only need one hand to hold a microphone, no hands if you have a microphone stand, you can also use your free hand to play on the keyboard as you sing. So let's try doing that. My pitch is back down to 0. And what I can do is I can like go up an octave, I could go up a fifth, and then just mess around that way. So. Actually, let's try turning up the blend here even more to make the effect more pronounced. So yeah, I think there's a lot to experiment with around that, and even if you're not a great singer, you can really cover up that fact. You just add a lot of reverb and a lot of density to your grains, and you can even do what I was just doing, which is singing really, really quietly into the microphone. You really don't need to belt things out with this. Okay, so that was one little loose end I wanted to tie. The other one is that I've shown mostly instrumental sounds so far, and now a little bit of vocals too, but you can also use drum sounds with the Texture Lab as an effects processor. So let me just show you that real quick. So I'm going to reset my pattern here and go back to the default parameters, and let's get a drum on my OP1. Okay, I'm going to exit effects mode for a moment so we just hear the dry sound. Now I'm going to go into effects mode with the default parameters. It's not going to sound super great, but that's kind of the point. And then we're going to modify things from there. So if I go into effects mode, now we're going to sound like this. So, I mean, it sounds kind of cool, but also kind of musically unusable. And the reason for that is, well, there's a couple things going on here. The first is we have the default reverb on, and remember the reverb is applying both to the granular and the dry side of the sound, and reverb can really mess with drums unless it's used very carefully. I think the easiest thing to do here is just turn the reverb completely off or really, really low. That's going to improve things right out of the gate. Now we're going to sound like this. But the sound we're getting from the granular side is still just a bit too busy and a bit too arrhythmic, at least for my taste. Now, there's a few things you can do with that. The first is you can dial back the blend so that we're mostly leaning on the dry side of our sound. And then all that messy granular stuff is just going to be in the background as sort of a texture. So that would sound like this. But to me, that's still a bit too messy. So what I would do here is, the first thing is that, remember, a lot of that swirliness that we're getting from our sound is due to the fact that we have grains going backwards. So I would maybe put all of the grains going forward. That would change our sound to this. And if we want, we could also take our size and put that down a little bit. And the further down we go with the size, and the more we're going to get into that bit crunch territory, which can add a cool texture to our drums. And then remember, we can also take our density, put that down, and get even glitchier here. Or to get really glitchy, we can put randomness on our size and shape parameters. Can barely hear it now, so let's put the blend back up. Maybe a bit too much. Alternatively, we could put the density all the way up. And remember, just like with our instrumental sounds, the shape parameter is really going to affect our sound here. So if I put that up a little bit. And then another thing that you can mess around with drum sounds is the pitch parameter. So with the pitch parameter with instruments, your only real options for making sounds that are actually musical is octaves and fifths and maybe fourths as well. But with drum sounds, since they're not really in a key, you can use just about any pitch value and it's going to sound okay. And you can even go back and forth between different pitch values. So this also requires a little bit of coordination. Let's see if I can do it. Try turning the size up here a little bit more. turning the blend up a bit more so we can get more of that sound. Alternatively, instead of the pitch knob, you could also mess around with the keyboard. And if you want, you could even put some glide between the notes. Let's try 47. So I don't think anything that I just played was especially great, but I'm just trying to convey some of the possibilities here to you. Yeah, those are some things you can do with drums. And the thing I was doing with the pitch knob, provides me with the perfect segue to the next section of this video, because what I was essentially doing with my hand here was I was manually modulating the pitch parameter. And of course, we can automatically modulate parameters as well. And that's what this next section is going to be about. And with this, we're going to take everything that we just went through and take it to a whole nother level, because what we were essentially doing before was we were setting a bunch of different parameter values in static positions and generating our sounds that way. But with modulation, we can change those values over time to different degrees and at different speeds, and thereby modulate our sound from one set of parameters to another set of parameters and all sorts of stages in between in either rhythmic or arrhythmic ways, maybe random ways, or ways that trace a certain pattern, like a sine wave or a square or whatever we want to do. And this opens up all sorts of possibilities and also adds a whole nother layer of complexity to it. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't think I've even scratched the surface of the possibilities that this unlocks, but it's something that I am exploring more and more, and it can lead to some really, really cool results. So let's look at that next. Okay, so I'm going to reset our pattern here, go back to the default values, and let's go back to a synth sound here. Okay, so let's start with a fairly simple modulation here. So one really obvious thing that people often modulate is filter. So let's put a low pass filter on this. And if I manually modulate this, it sounds like this, which can add some nice movement to an otherwise static sound. Of course, it's a bit of a pain in the neck to devote an entire hand to doing that modulation, so let's automate it. I will go to filter cutoff, and for starters, let's just go to the mid values. It's probably going to be too extreme, but we can change it from there. So now it sounds like this. And yeah, that's a bit too extreme, at least for my tastes. So let's dial back the rate. Maybe 7. The dip there is a bit too extreme for me. So what we can do here is where we set the cutoff with this knob, currently it's in the middle, it's sort of like the pivot point around which the modulation is happening. And so if we, for example, put this up a bit, now we're going to sound like this. So yeah, you really just have to play around with the position on the cutoff knob and then also with your rate and depth to get a good sound. And then keep in mind a couple things with modulation on the Texture Lab. First of all, we do have lots of shapes. The default shape is sine wave, so this is the shape of the modulation as it's happening. But we also have square, where we're going to go sort of like perpendicularly from one extreme to another without a transition between them. And actually, let's turn the rate up a little bit so we're not waiting too long here. Okay, and then there's a whole bunch of other shapes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but one thing I would point out here is that if you are going for a more glitchy sound, random can be pretty cool on the modulation. So just using the parameters we already had, that's now going to sound like this. So there's a little bit of glitchiness going on with the filter modulation. And if we had an actual glitchy sound going on, so let's just create that real quick. Gonna turn the size way down, turn the density way down, add some randomness to the delay, and just for fun, let's pitch everything up on the granular side an octave. And I have no idea what this is gonna sound like. Let's find out. So yeah, getting a lot glitchier. Let's turn off the blend so we can hear that glitchy granular side more. Turn the size down even more, turn the density down even more. Oh, and let's turn our reverb down. So yeah, check out the random shape if you're going for a glitchy sound. And then one other thing to keep in mind with the automated modulations is that you can also turn on mod sync here. And with mod sync, the rate of the modulation, instead of being a value from 0 to 127, the value is now going to be some sort of note value. And that is going to be synced with your beats per minute on the texture lab if the clock is set to internal. However, if you have a synth and you connect it to the Texture Lab with a MIDI cable, you can then have the Texture Lab's modulations synced with your synth. And unfortunately, I don't have the right chords to do that with my OP1 and Texture Lab, so I can't demonstrate that. That's another thing to explore as well. It's not fundamentally different than what we were doing before because this is just a different way of calculating the rate of the modulation, and it's a way of syncing it with an external device. Okay, so that was just one automated modulation, and we have two modulators, and we can modulate any of the granular parameters as well as the filter cutoff and resolution. I'm not going to belabor the point and go through all of the parameters, but one that I do want to draw attention to is the pitch parameter. So I'm going to reset our pattern again, go back to the default parameters, and this time I am going to modulate the pitch. And for this, I am just going to set the depth to a very, very small number. Usually I wouldn't go beyond 2. If you're feeling very adventurous, you could go to 3 or 4, but really 1 or 2 is usually going to be what you're going to want to do here. And then for the rate, I'm going to go to some kind of mid value here. Okay, so now our dry sound again. And our effects mode sound sounds like this. It's a bit hard to hear what's going on here, so let's turn the reverb off. I'm going to turn the blend up a little bit more so we can focus more on the granular side. So you can hear that sort of waveriness to the sound. Turn the blend all the way up. You can really hear it. You can really hear it at the end there. Let's actually try this with that other synth sound, the more string sounding one. So remember, this sounds like this. And with those parameters we just had, it sounds like this in effects mode. And another really cool thing you can do with pitch modulations is you can change the octave of them. So if I go an octave up, and let's turn our blend back down a little bit so we can hear some of the original sound. Now we're going to sound like this. And if you watched my previous video, maybe that sounds a little bit familiar, because if I get out my guitar, this pitch modulation and pitch bifurcation, all that was one of the main things going on with my final patch in that video, the one that I called Mars, because it sounds kind of, I don't know, otherworldly to me. So on guitar, this sounds like this. Okay, so that was modulating parameters using the built-in automated modulators, but there's a whole nother way of, in effect, modulating on the texture lab, and it opens up even more possibilities. And so I want to show you this next. I am back in an empty pattern, and what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to focus on reverb. The thing is, on the texture lab, the built-in modulators don't allow us to modulate the reverb. However, we can record any parameter changes that we want onto the sequencer. And so what we can do is we can basically manually create our own modulation using the sequencer and parameter recording. So there's a couple ways of doing this. Let me show you this one first. For starters, I'm going to turn parameter recording on, and then I'm going to go into recording mode on the sequencer, just have 16 steps. And I'm going to put on shift so that I don't have to hold this button down as I'm changing the reverb value. And I'm going to start by setting our reverb all the way down to 0 on step 1. And then on step 2, I'm just going to push it up a little bit. And you could do this more or less gradually depending on how you want to do it. Remember, you have actually 127 steps available to you. So in theory, you could go through this step by step and just do increments of 1. Although I think I would go insane after about 20 steps of doing that. So I'm going to do it a little less gradually. Let's just, I don't know, go up to 8 and then 16. And then I'm just going to keep going like this. I'm going to fast forward through this since it will be tedious to watch. Okay, so by step 16, I'm all the way up to 120, so almost maxing out the reverb. And so now if we play through this sequence, I'm going to start on 0 on step 1, and then by step 9, for example, we're going to be all the way up to 71, and by 16, we're going to be all the way up to 120. And so I'm going to turn this on and play a chord. Okay, so you can hear the space kind of expanding from the beginning to the end, and hopefully you also noticed a little problem going on here, which is that by the very end, we get to that maximum value, but then when we go back to step 1, we're immediately going all the way from the maximum value all the way down to the minimum value. And that's a really jarring transition. And so what I'm going to want to do here is I don't just want to go up to a maximum value. I also want to go back down to my minimum value so that the final step of my sequence is more or less the same as my first step. And just to build on top of what I already have here, one way I could do that is by changing the length of the pattern to 32. And then we can just go to step 17 and pick up where we left off, and then just start doing everything we just did in reverse. So move this back down a little bit, and then a little bit more on step 18, a little bit more on step 19, and so forth and so on, until I get to the final step. Now our final step is very close to our first step. So from the beginning to the end of the sequence, we're now going to be able to start down, go up, go back down, and then our sequence starts over again. So let's hear what this sounds like. All right, now a couple things to keep in mind here are that the difference between your minimum value and your maximum value is in effect the depth that you are giving to your modulation. If you want less depth, you would want to have less difference between the minimum and maximum value. And then the thing that's analogous to rate here is our beats per minute. If I increase the beats per minute, well, now we're going to be cycling through those modulations at a much more rapid pace, like this. Alternatively, we could slow it down, and then we're decreasing the rate of our modulation. Okay, so that's with reverb, but you can also do the same technique with any of the other parameters, for example, density. And for this, I'm going to show you another method of recording these modulations onto the sequencer, and that is to just let your sequencer run and then twist the knob as it runs with parameter recording on. So now I'm going to turn that back on. I'm going to hit play, and the moment I hit play, I'm going to start moving the knob. And I'm going to try to replicate the same thing I did before, where by the end of the first page on my sequencer, so step 16, I'm going to get to my maximum value, and then when I reach the second page, steps 17 through 32, I'm going to start going down so that I get a more or less sine wave shape. So let's give this a try. Okay, so I didn't do that perfectly. It can be a bit tricky to do, especially if you're trying to do it with two hands at once. But one thing you may have noticed there was that I kept the BPM really low. That's something I would recommend doing. One thing to keep in mind here is that although you are gradually moving the knob and gradually changing the parameter value, on the sequencer what's happening is that at any given moment, it's basically taking a snapshot of where you're at on the knob at that particular moment. And so at step 5, for example, maybe I'm at a value of 40, and then by the time step 6 ends, maybe I've gone all the way up to, 55. A pretty big leap between those two values. It's not going to sound that gradual. And even though you record it slowly, you can always bump up the BPM if you want the modulation to happen at a faster rate. And you may be wondering here, okay, with reverb, the utility is obvious because you don't have access to that parameter on the built-in modulators, but density you do, so why bother with this? And I would say that it can just be kind of tricky to get these modulations to work in just the way you want them to work, and so this gives you a lot more manual control. For example, you can get the modulations to happen much more slowly than you can even if you set the rate on the automated modulators to as low as possible. It just doesn't go as slowly as I'd like it to go, especially if I'm doing something more ambient where I want the modulation to be super, super gradual. So yeah, this gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot more control. And it also allows you to modulate more than two things because you can layer as many of these modulations as you want onto the sequencer. And to show you that in action, I'm going to take a whole different approach to this. And that brings me to another thing that you can do with the sequencer and using it as a sort of manual modulator, which is this. So I'm going to reset my pattern once again, go back to the default values, and let's set the length of our sequencer to 32 again, and I'm just going to hit play. This time, actually, instead of going slow, I'm going to purposefully go fast, and this way things are going to be kind of out of control, and we're not going to have gradual transitions with the parameter changes. Things are going to be much more jagged, there's going to be a lot more leaps, and this is going to give us some more glitchy sounding effects. So turn parameter recording on, and now I'm just going to do this kind of randomly. I'm just going to start messing around with the knobs. Here I'm doing density. Now let's do some size. Now let's do some shape. Now let's do some blend. It's going to sound pretty terrible when you're doing it this fast, but just wait here because it's going to sound different when we slow things down. What else could we do? Well, we could do some reverb again. Could even record changes in the direction onto the sequencer. So you could start backwards and go forward and back, forward and back. You could record changes in the delay time. You could do diffusion and timing too. I just realized I forgot to even talk about diffusion. One thing with diffusion is if you're going for more ethereal sounds, it can help sometimes to crank the diffusion up so you have more of a sense of space and stereo sound. Keep that in mind, and we can manually modulate that as well. Could modulate some filter as well. Let's try a low pass filter, and I'm going to modulate the cutoff on the sequencer. This is probably going to be kind of crazy sounding at the end. Okay, I think we've done enough here. You can modulate pitch too, but it's going to get very unmusical if you do that. Okay, so now let's turn our sequencer down to a more reasonable level, and I have no idea what this is going to sound like. When you do this kind of random approach, sometimes things sound great, sometimes they sound terrible. The nice thing is, I mean, as you just saw, that took me like 1 or 2 minutes to do, so you can crank these out, a bunch of them in a row, and if they're bad, just get rid of them, and nobody else ever has to hear them, and if they're good, you keep them, and then you make some music with them, and then people think you're a musical genius because they only ever hear the good stuff. They don't have to hear all the bad stuff that you have to go through to get to the good stuff. And I think that's really like the mentality you have to take with this, is just play around with it, experiment with it, embrace failure as part of the process. You have to go through the bad stuff to get to the good stuff. So disclaimer, this could be bad. I don't know. Let's find out. 3, 2, 1, end. It's kind of interesting. One thing we might want to do here is we might want to pitch everything on our granular side up or down. And if we want to do that, just remember to exit parameter recording mode, turn this button back to green, and now these will be global changes that I apply here. And so now we're going to be able to hopefully hear the granular side and the dry side as being more distinct, which will sound like this. I'm thinking actually I shouldn't have done the reverb on this. Let's turn the reverb all the way down. So yeah, pretty crazy. And you can take all sorts of different approaches with this. For example, if we restart this and let's crank the BPM back up, play the sequencer, go into parameter recording. And this time I'm going to keep the density fairly low. Let's just wiggle that around a bit. Take the size, wiggle that around a bit at fairly low values. Let's do just a little bit of change in the delay. I'm going to exit this. I'm going to go back out to global mode. I'm going to turn the reverb down all the way, and let's turn the blend up a bit so we can really hear the granular side. And pitch, well, let's just leave it as neutral for now. Let's hear what this sounds like. Yeah, a bit too extreme. Let's try wiggling this around at larger values. Same thing with density. So density and size, I'm changing to larger values. I don't know, something like that. Let's hear what that sounds like. Yeah, I think that's better. And let's go back into global mode on the parameters, and let's try pitching everything down on the granular side an octave. Let's turn the BPM down. A bit too muddy. Let's try an octave up. I like that more. Let's turn the blend even further up, actually. So you can start to get much more glitchy, staticky, sort of distorted sounds. Let's try turning the timing down this time. That's kind of cool. Let's turn the blend all the way up. I wonder what my voice would sound like with this effect going on. Let's try that. Singing a song about something. I don't know what I'm singing. So yeah, glitchier stuff definitely possible with this. You want to make it even glitchier. Something you can do is record a bunch of parameter changes. Actually, let me just do this real quick. So reset. I'm going to do this super randomly. Density, size, really mash this up, do direction, yeah, okay. Let's do delay, all right. Let's do blend, yeah. And, okay, let's just leave it at that. And now we're gonna sound like this. Actually, let's go into global, turn the reverb off. So now we sound like this. Okay, if we want to make things even more random and more glitchy, something that we can do is go into random mode on the sequencer and then change this value here to something like 1 so that we're randomizing every single step. And let's try a different synth sound. So let's go back to our strings. So remember, this sounds like this. This can also be cool if you have another sequencer for your original sound source and you're using that sequencer in conjunction with the sequencer on the texture lab. That would be like the perfect situation for having a MIDI cable going from your sound source to the texture lab and syncing the tempos. I don't have the chords to do that. Instead, I'm going to just take my BPM here, which is 105, and match these guys, turn off the play button, go into my OP1 sequencer, play this sequence. What I can do is, this is sort of like the poor man's version of MIDI sync, where I'm going to try to press play on my sequencer on my OP1 and my sequencer on my texture lab at exactly the same moment. Can mess around with the blend here. Turn it way down, the blend, so it's just a background texture. And remember, you can always change the note value. So if I want to keep them manually synced, but cut the rate of modulation in half here, I can just change this to eighth notes and then do the same thing and just try to manually press play on both devices at the same time. By the way, on my OP1, I was pitching the sequence up by a fifth and then an octave. So that's why the sound changed a little bit there. Yeah, all sorts of possibilities with that as well. But let's just keep going on because there's two more uses of the sequencer for modulation that I want to show you that are completely different than the ones we've done so far. So for this, I'm going to reset our pattern. And on my OP1, let's exit the sequencer, go back to our Korg sound. Okay, so remember that on the texture lab, we can use the keys to pitch things up or down. So for example, if I just hold a middle C here, I can go up a fifth, I can go up an octave, I can go up an octave and a fifth, an octave and a fourth, or just a fourth. Toggling back and forth between a fourth and a fifth there, or I could go down a fifth or fourth. And of course I could do any other note values I want, but things start to get more complicated if you go outside of octaves, fourths, and fifths. Again, for music theoretical reasons that I won't go into. So with that in mind, that we can play the keys on here, what we can also do is play the keys onto the sequencer. So for example, I could put in my middle C, my neutral note, from steps 1 to 4. Then I could go up a fifth for steps 5 through 8. Then I could go up an octave for steps 9 to 12. And then I could go back down a fifth for steps 13 through 16. And now we can just play the pattern. like always, we can make that go faster or slower depending upon our BPM. If we crank the BPM up, it sounds like this. Or we could make it go super low. It'll often sound a lot better if you time your chord changes or melodic changes with the sequencer, so that as we shift from one section to the next, this being one section, this another section, this another section, we have those two things coincide with each other. Again, this is another place where MIDI sync can be very useful, especially if you're playing music from a sequencer. So let's take a look at that real quick. Once again, I don't have the MIDI cable, so I'm going to be doing this manually. Let's set our BPM to 105, since my BPM is 105 on my OP1. And I'm just going to try to press play on both devices simultaneously. 3, 2, 1, end. Again, maybe it would be better if we turned the note value down so we have the time. As you could see me doing there, I was messing around with the different parameter values as the sequence played. Another thing to keep in mind with this melodic sequencing is that we still have access to the pitch knob. And so, for example, if I want to take this entire pattern and pitch it up an octave, I can do that. If you wanted to, you could combine the things we looked at previously with this. We could record parameter changes onto the sequencer in addition to the note values. So go back into parameter recording. I'm going to do this with the second method of doing this, where I just hit play and then change the knobs as I go. Remember that at any point you can press freeze. And then if I wanted to, I could play on top of that. Could even add some drums in. So yeah, lots of possibilities with that as well. And once again, if you wanted to make things even more glitchy and random, you can turn random on. Get into very glitchy stuff with that. Let's turn random off. And another thing I want to show you here is with the note values on the sequencer, remember that you do have the glide value as well. And so you can glide between these pitch variations. And that will sound like this. Which can be a bit too extreme at high BPMs. So if we turn this down, it'll sound a bit more reasonable, I think. So for this, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating a rhythm on the sequence. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to keep things super simple, and I'm going to do a rhythm that's just going to be bum, 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 bum. The way I'm going to do that on the sequencer is going 1, 5, 9, 11, 13. 1, 5, 9, 11, 13. And we could do this with any parameter that we want, but I think the one that's going to make the effect the clearest is filter. So I'm going to put a low pass filter on this, and then what I'm going to do is go into parameter recording mode, sequencer recording mode, go to the first step, and I'm going to take the filter on this step and I'm going to move it all the way down so that you can barely hear the sound. Okay, now here comes the crucial part. So remember, I'm targeting 1, 5, 9, 11, 13. However, I'm not going to go straight to step 5. Instead, I'm going to go to the very next step on my sequencer, step 2, and I'm going to take that filter and I'm going to reset it all the way up to the top. If I don't do that, what's going to happen is the filter's still going to be down low on 2, still going to be down low on 3, on 4, and throughout the entire sequence, which is not what we want. We want it to just go down on the 1 and then go immediately back up on the 2. So I'm going to take the knob and I'm going to move it all the way up. And so now we can hear it on 2 and we can barely hear it on 1. So okay, now I don't have to worry about 3 or 4 because remember how parameter recording actually works. On step 1, what we're basically telling the texture lab is, okay, I want you to take that filter value and put it down to 0, pretend as if like an invisible hand came and changed the knob down to 0, and then just keep it there until I tell you to do something else. And if we never tell it to do anything else, well, it's never going to do anything else. And so that's why on step 2, we have to bring it back up if that's what we want to happen. But then from that point on, for 3 and 4, we don't have to touch anything because the value is going to be maintained until we manipulate it again. And where we want to do that again is on the 5, our second beat. So here, I'm going to go all the way back down to 0 on the filter. And then immediately on step 6, the next step, I'm going to reset things back up to the top. That'll take care of 6, 7, and 8. And then on step 9, my next beat, now I'm going to go all the way back down and then go back up for 10 to reset things. And then here, since we want to go bum, 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 on the 11, I'm going to go down, and the 12, I'm going to go up. And then on my final beat, the 13, I'll go back down one last time, and on the 14, I'll go up one last time. Press play on the sequencer, and we're going to sound like this. So you get this sort of like automatic rhythm to your chords if you're playing chords this way. And of course, if you want that rhythm to go faster, you can just bump up your BPM. Let's go crazy and go to 250. And of course, you could turn it down too. You could do this with any parameters, and you could also do this in conjunction with sequencers. So I've slowed down the sequence to quarter notes on my OP1. So without effects mode on, it sounds like this. A little boring by itself, but turn on effects mode and try to sync these up manually, and it sounds like this. So I'm not going to belabor the point by going through a bunch of different parameter changes with rhythmic modulation, but one thing I do want to draw your attention to is that in what I just showed you, we were basically cutting out the sound with our rhythm. So with each ba 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 bum, we were decreasing the sound essentially. We could also go in the opposite direction and make the sound get bigger with each one of those rhythmic pulses. So just to give you a quick example of that, let me reset this. So this time what I'm going to do is is I'm going to do the same rhythm as before. I'm going to target the 1, 5, 9, 11, 13. And I'm going to take my density and I'm going to crank it all the way up on those pulses. And then I'm not going to turn it all the way down, but I'm going to turn it barely down to like 20, let's say. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the 5, the 9, 11, and 13. And I'm going to fast forward through doing this. And we could target those same steps and put other parameter changes on as well. So for example, on each one of our target steps, we could take the size all the way up. And then for the 2, for example, I could go down to 30 because I don't want to get too far into bit crunch territory. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my other target steps. Okay, and now we sound like this. So yeah, there's a lot more you can do with these rhythmic modulations. And keep in mind that another option that you have with rhythm on the Texture Lab and in sequencing in general is adding some swing. Let's do this in a really exaggerated way and put it on the maximum value. That sounds like this. Lots of possibilities here. I mean, you could turn the swing down to a more moderate value, like 25. Go back to our string sound. You slow this down, it could be really cool for ambient. And let's pick a different sound. So this is one of my favorite sounds on my OP1, which feels kind of narcissistic to say because it's my own voice. It sounds like this. So that's without effects mode on. If we turn effects mode on, and if you have access to external effects, you could, for example, put some delay on before the sound gets to the Texture Lab. So now this sounds like this. And I'm guessing that's going to sound pretty crazy when we put it into effects mode. Or we could even add some delay to our delay by turning on the delay on the Texture Lab. Oh, I have parameter lock on. Should have turned that off. Hopefully this will still work. Let's see. I know I keep saying it over and over again, but there's so much room for experimentation. Okay, so I think that's all I really wanted to say about rhythmic modulation on the sequencer. And now there's one last thing I want to show you here, and it's sort of a bonus, both for this video and for effects mode and the Texture Lab in general. And it's something that some of you may already know about, but I'm guessing a lot of you don't because I didn't know about it for a while. But if you go on to the Sonicware website, there's a particular section of it where you're going to find an entire pack of 16 free bonus presets that are designed specifically for effects mode. So these are not the 16 presets that come preloaded onto the Texture Lab. It's an entirely different pack. You have to download them and install them onto the Texture Lab yourself. I'm going to include a link both to the section of the website where you'll find them and also a video that'll help you out with installing the presets. And if you want to just start producing sounds through the Texture Lab, using it as an effects processor, and you don't want to have to mess around with making your own patches from scratch, this can be a great starting point. And like I said, there's 16 of them, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just want to show you a few of my favorites and then also give you some tips on how to use them. So the first one is called Ethereal. So I'm going to use my voice sample again. That's our dry sound, and if I turn effects mode on, ethereal sounds like this. Or to go back to our voca sample, so back to this guy, that sounds like this. And as you can hear, the sound just keeps ringing on and on and on, and that is because this patch uses the infinite reverb, which is cranked up to 102, and then, for example, we have the grain size maxed out to 127, density all the way up to the top almost, 124. Blend is in the middle. And the way I'm showing you these values brings me to a tip I have, which is if you don't have latch turned on, which is this button right here, I would recommend turning that on, because what it allows you to do is you can touch any one of these knobs, like the size knob, and it's going to initially show you what the current value is of that parameter. And if I'm not on that value, I can wiggle around the knob and it's not going to affect anything. The only way I can change it is by going to the value, reaching that point, and now I can change it. And what that allows you to do is two things. First of all, it allows you to actually see what the parameter values are, and that allows you to dissect these presets and see what's going into them, which A, allows you to understand how the presets are working, but B, also helps you to get your head around what each of these parameters is doing in general. And the other thing that it allows you to do is you can isolate any one of these parameters and start manipulating it and see what that does. And that allows you to do two things as well. One is you can get a further handle on what these parameters are doing, because the best way to see what one particular thing is doing in a composite thing is to take it out and see what happens when it's not there. So for example, what happens if we take size and turn it down to 0? Now we sound like this. Same thing with density. Take out both density and size and see what that does. If we turn the blend all the way up, we can focus on what's going on the granular side, which is just a burst of static, which makes sense since our size and density are at 0. We crank them back up, sounds like this. And now we can really hear what's going on the granular side, which is that our pitch is all the way down. If we manipulate that, can bring out a whole different character to this preset. Now let's go back to blending that in. And could keep going with this. What happens if we make the pitch neutral? Or up to 12. Can you hear that waveriness to the pitch? I'm guessing there's some modulation on this, and yep, if I hit assign, I can see that pitch is modulating, and since I have latch on, I can hit shift and see what these values are. So mod sync is on, and that is our rate value, and our depth is 3. So I could experiment with what happens if we turn this up. 5, for example. Ooh. Doesn't sound so great, does it? Turn it off, see what happens if we take that out. Or what if we go back to 3 and we mess around with the rate? What if we make it super fast? Maybe a little less. So yeah, you can take any one of these presets and approach it with this almost like scientific / almost childlike mentality of just like, you know, what happens if I take this one thing out? Or what happens if I manipulate this one value? How does that affect this particular patch? And also, what does that do with sound in general? And it can really help you to start intuitively understanding what these parameters are doing. I don't think there's another modulator. Oh, there's a filter cutoff modulator on here as well. Now I'm genuinely curious, what is that doing? Let's see. So it's set to 60, and that's our rate. What happens if we change the depth, for example? increase the rate. And let's try turning down the reverb. Completely new sound that I've created. I mean, it shares some similarities with the original, but it's also very different. And so I've put my own spin on it. And that's another thing that you can do with these or any presets in general, is use them as like a springboard or a starting point, make some changes, push them in a new direction, and make them your own. So definitely something you can do with all of these presets. Another thing that I would keep in mind with these presets, let's take another one like scatter. So this one does use the sequencer. Some of them do, some of them don't. This one is a much more subtle effect. Let's use a different synth sound for this. Go back to our strings, turn the sequencer on. So yeah, it's really, really subtle. Something that you can do with any of these presets is if you take the blend and increase it, you're usually going to exaggerate the core effect of the preset. So with this one, for example, with the blend almost all the way up, so yeah, a much more subtle effect just by nature, but we can hear it more if we turn up the blend. And with this sort of preset, if I turn it all the way up, because there's a delay, it's going to be really difficult to just play it on the keyboard like this, because I don't hear anything until a few seconds later. So this is one where it might really work to use a sequencer. So let's try to manually sync these. Can't hear anything at first, but now the sequencer is doing its thing. Try switching sounds. And once again, if there's anything I don't like about any of these sounds, I can just change it. So let's try making our density higher and our size higher. So yeah, I'm just trying to give examples of ways you can play around with these. Let's do another one here. Ooh, okay, here's a weird one. So this is called percussion, I think, and it is a very extreme sound. By default, the blend is set all the way up to the top. So we're just hearing the granular side, and it sounds super crazy if we play something melodically, so. And if you know what to do with that musically, you are a much better musician than me, but I have no idea. We could turn the blend down and just have that kind of be in the background, but I think it's really meant, as the name implies, to be used with percussive sounds, so. So yeah, that is one of the weirder effects, but it is not the weirdest effect. I think the award for that goes to the politically incorrectly named schizoid. It sounds like this. So I'm just going to hold down a neutral C again and go back to our Korg sound. So yeah, you get these really like off-kilter pitch changes that are not really in the original key in an intentional sort of way. This can sound really weird if you start playing chords or melodically. Some very strange stuff. If we go back to strings, it sounds like this. It's weird because it sounds normal for a while, like kind of weird but normal, and then all of a sudden you have that dip where you go into atonal territory. Atonal in the sense of going outside of the original key. but it's kind of a cool spooky sound and I really like it. Another one that's really cool and very extreme is warp. So let's go back to our Korg sound. And this one, again, very extreme. The blend is set to 127 by default. Let's just hear that first. So one thing we might do here is turn the blend down just a little bit. If we turn it too far down, we're not going to actually hear the effect. So let's just go down to like 118, try that. See, that's another piece of advice I have for you, which is that if you're messing around with the blend, which is often a really good idea, it's a little counterintuitive. You would think that like going into the middle would be a good idea here, but really I don't think you're going to hear the effect much at all. Just because the original sound is overpowering that granular sound. The granular sound is pretty soft. So for these, you just want to dial it back a really small amount. Okay, and then one last pattern that I want to show you is this one. I forget what the name of it is, but it's sort of like a tape emulation effect. If we just play it the way it is right out of the box, it's going to sound like this. So you have these really sharp kind of pitch modulations. I would prefer not to have those. So something you can do with this patch is just delete the notes. This change won't be saved unless you save the pattern, so don't worry about that. You can play around with these. So anyway, I deleted the notes on the pattern, but the other parameter changes are maintained on it. So now it's going to sound like this. Turn the blend up here even more. So we're still having some pitch modulations here. I think there's a pitch modulator on this. And once again, we can mess with this in whatever way we want. For example, let's try pitching everything up an octave. And let's try blending that into our original. So we start getting this cool discrepancy between the two octaves, and we could go in the opposite direction, an octave down. And then another thing I want to show you here, and this is a more general point, but it applies to this patch in particular, I think, is that there's no rule that you have to use these presets, or any presets you come up with, just in effects mode. You can just turn this button off, and now we're back in synthesizer mode, but this preset is still going to work. And I can just select a sample, like this one, which is my violin. We're pitched down an octave, so it sounds a bit more like a cello. Yeah, that pitch modulation's pretty extreme. Let's try going down an octave, but putting the blend all the way up so we don't have that discrepancy between the two octaves. And then one last idea I want to leave you with here is this, which is to just go through your samples on your texture lab and just randomly pick one and see what it sounds like. So for example, I don't remember off the top of my head what sample 30 is. We're about to find out. And that is something crazy on this side of the blend, on the dry side. That is super crazy. I'm guessing that it's because the position is being randomized. Yeah, being randomized a lot. So it's bouncing all over the place, which sounds crazy in dry mode. But over on the granular side, that sounds pretty nice. So yeah, this is a piano sample. And That actually brings up another point I could make here, which is don't give up on a sound too easily. For example, if I initially had this blend set all the way down to 0, I could very easily decide, okay, this whole preset that I've created is complete garbage, it's unusable, but sometimes it's just a single parameter that's holding it back, and in this case it's blend. Anyways, I'm not going to go through more samples, I think you get the idea, but the other thing I wanted to encourage you to do was that if you are feeding a synthesizer into the texture lab, I would embrace that same experimental, just random, see what works and what doesn't work approach, and just go through your presets, whatever sounds you've created on your synth, just see what happens. So for example, I have no idea what any of these presets are because the OP1 just names them by the dates that they were created. So I'm just going to go through them and see what they sound like using this preset. That's pretty nice. So originally that just sounds like this. Very kind of run-of-the-mill pad and with effects mode. It just gives it that extra character that makes it sound more special. That's kind of cool. Pitch modulation's a bit too extreme, so let's turn it down. So yeah, I mean, it's a subtle effect in this case, but I think that sounds a lot cooler than just... that extra bit of movement, that extra bit of waveriness, tape emulation, and yeah, it's just a cool little effect. Yeah, I could keep going with this, but I think this video has already gone on long enough. Anyway, remember, I'm going to put a bunch of links to the Sonicware presets down below, and I have a couple more Texture Lab videos that are going to be coming out soon, I hope, so do stay tuned for those. They're going to be a lot shorter than this one, I promise. The subject matters are much smaller. Anyway, I'm going to go walk my dog now. Thank you for watching, have a great day, and goodbye for now.